Picture this. You're sitting in divorce court, watching your billionaire husband's lawyers prove you signed away rights to his $2.8 billion empire. The prenup seems airtight. You're about to lose everything. Your fortune, your home, even your children. But what if I told you that this wasn't just a divorce? It was the exposure of the biggest tech fraud in history. What if the woman everyone thought was having a mental breakdown was actually an award-winning investigative journalist who had unknowingly married the very criminal she'd been trying to catch for years? This is the true story of Sarah Mitchell, a Pulitzer Prize winner who gave up everything for love, only to discover her fairy tale marriage was actually an elaborate criminal conspiracy. By the time you finish listening, you'll understand how one woman's fight for her children became a federal investigation that brought down a billion-dollar empire built on stolen dreams. This is the prenup twist, and nothing is what it seems. Sarah Mitchell sat in the mahogany-paneled courtroom, her hands trembling as she clutched a manila envelope. Across the aisle, her soon-to-be ex-husband, David Sterling, looked immaculate in his tailored Armani suit, whispering confidently to his team of corporate lawyers. "Your Honor," Marcus Chen, David's lead attorney, addressed the judge with practiced authority. "The prenuptial agreement is crystal clear. My client's technology company, Sterling Solutions, was established and valued at $2.8 billion before the marriage. Mrs. Mitchell has no legal claim to these premarital assets." Judge Patricia Hawkins examined the documents through her reading glasses. Sarah's heart sank as she watched the judge's expression grow more serious with each page. "Mrs. Morrison," the judge turned to Sarah's overworked public defender, Jake Morrison. "Does your client have any evidence to contest this prenuptial agreement?" Jake shuffled through his sparse files. At 38, he looked exhausted from handling too many cases with too little resources. "Your Honor, we believe the circumstances surrounding the signing of this agreement merit further investigation." Marcus Chen scoffed audibly. "Your Honor, this is a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. The agreement was signed 12 years ago by a then-successful investigative journalist who clearly understood legal documents. Mrs. Mitchell cannot claim ignorance now that the marriage has failed." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that fateful day 12 years ago. She had been at the peak of her career, having just won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing corruption in city government. David had swept her off her feet during her investigation into tech startup fraud. How ironic that seemed now. "David, this seems awfully complicated," she had said, staring at the lengthy prenuptial agreement. "Sweetheart, it's just standard protection," David had assured her, his blue eyes sparkling with sincerity. "My family lawyers insist on it. Besides, we're building a life together. What's mine will be yours in every way that matters." She had been so in love, so trusting. The prenup seemed like a formality, a small price to pay for their fairy tale romance. "Your Honor," Jake tried again, "we request additional time to examine the circumstances surrounding this agreement." "Mr. Morrison, you've had 6 months to prepare your case," Judge Hawkins replied sternly. "Do you have specific evidence of fraud or coercion?" Sarah watched Jake's shoulders slump. They both knew the answer. David had been too smart, too careful. The prenup appeared airtight. "Furthermore," Marcus Chen continued, producing another set of documents, "my client is prepared to offer a generous settlement of $2 million, despite having no legal obligation to do so. This demonstrates his continued affection for the mother of his children." $2 million. It sounded like a fortune to most people, but Sarah knew it was pocket change to David. Sterling Solutions had revolutionized data encryption, making David one of the youngest billionaires in tech history. $2 million was what he spent on wine each year. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Hawkins addressed Sarah directly, "you understand that by rejecting this settlement, you risk walking away with only what the law mandates under the prenuptial agreement." Sarah stood slowly. At 42, she felt decades older than the confident journalist she had once been. 12 years of suburban motherhood had softened her edges, dulled her investigative instincts. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand." "Very well. We'll recess for 30 minutes while you consult with your attorney." As the courtroom emptied, Sarah remained seated, staring at the manila envelope in her hands. Inside were photographs from happier times their wedding day, the birth of their children Emma and Ryan, family vacations to David's estate in the Hamptons. Sarah, we need to talk about realistic expectations, Jake said gently, sliding into the seat beside her. I gave up everything for him, Sarah whispered. My career, my independence, my identity. I became Sarah Sterling, the perfect tech wife. And now I'm supposed to walk away with nothing. 2 million isn't nothing. It is when you've helped build a $1 billion empire. Jake sighed. Sarah, I've seen this before. Wealthy men don't make mistakes in their prenups. They have teams of lawyers ensuring every loophole is closed. Sarah looked at her reflection in the courtroom's dark windows. Somewhere beneath the tired mother and neglected wife was the investigative journalist who had once brought down a corrupt mayor. That woman wouldn't have given up so easily, but that woman also wouldn't have been naive enough to sign away her future. The 30-minute recess stretched into an hour as Jake frantically made phone calls in the courthouse hallway. Sarah sat alone on a wooden bench, watching lawyers and litigants hurry past. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged except her. Sarah, we have a problem, Jake said, returning with his face pale. A big problem. He sat down heavily beside her, running his hands through his thinning hair. David's team just filed an emergency motion for full custody of Emma and Ryan. Sarah felt the world tilt. But that wasn't part of the divorce proceedings. It is now. They're claiming you're mentally unstable and unfit for custody. That's insane. I'm a good mother. Those kids are everything to me. Jake opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick legal document. They found your medical records from 11 years ago. The postpartum depression after Ryan was born, the anxiety medication. Sarah's blood ran cold. I took antidepressants for 6 months. That was over a decade ago. They're painting it as ongoing mental health issues. They have documentation of recent prescription pickups. Those were for Emma's anxiety medication. She had panic attacks before the divorce proceedings started. Sarah's voice cracked. They're using my daughter's stress against me. There's more, Jake said quietly. They have witness statements claiming you've been emotionally unstable, erratic behavior, neglecting the children's needs. From who? Household staff, David's sister Victoria, even some of the other mothers from the kids' school. Sarah stared at the papers in disbelief. Victoria Sterling has hated me since the day I married David, and the household staff work for him. As for the school mothers, she paused, remembering the cold shoulders and whispered conversations that had followed news of the divorce. They're protecting their own marriages. No one wants to support the woman who might expose what their husbands are really like. Sarah, I have to ask, have you been drinking, taking any medications that weren't prescribed? Absolutely not. She stood up abruptly, anger flashing in her eyes. Jake, you're supposed to be my lawyer. Are you questioning my fitness as a mother too? I have to prepare for what they'll throw at us. David Sterling has unlimited resources and the best legal team money can buy. They wouldn't file this motion unless they thought they could win. Sarah began pacing the narrow hallway. Other people's legal dramas continued around them, but her world had narrowed to this single nightmare. Losing half of David's fortune was one thing. Losing her children was unthinkable. What do they want? She asked. Full physical custody with supervised visitation for you. They're claiming the children need stability during this difficult transition. Stability. David works 80 hours a week. He's traveled 300 days out of the last year. I'm the one who raised those kids. That may not matter if they can prove you're unfit. Sarah stopped pacing and faced Jake directly. Then we prove I'm not. With what, Sarah? You can't afford a custody battle. My legal aid office is already stretched thin, handling your divorce case. Fighting both battles simultaneously? He shook his head. It could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then what are you suggesting? Take the settlement. $2 million in joint custody. It's better than losing everything. Joint custody with David means I'll see my children every other weekend. He'll drag them around the world, put them in boarding schools, turn them into mini versions of himself. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. Those kids will forget they ever had a mother who actually loved them. Jake looked at his watch. We need to get back in there. What do you want me to tell the judge? Sarah picked up her manila envelope and squared her shoulders. Tell him we're rejecting the settlement. We're going to fight. Sarah, I can't promise we'll win. Then we'll lose fighting instead of lose surrendering. They walked back into the courtroom together. But Sarah felt utterly alone. David's legal team had tripled in size, with additional attorneys carrying boxes of files. Whatever evidence they had compiled against her, it was substantial. As she took her seat, Sarah caught David's eye across the aisle. For just a moment, his confident mask slipped, and she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Not anger or frustration, but cold calculation. This wasn't about money or even the children. This was about complete destruction. Marcus Chen stood as Judge Hawkins returned to the bench. Your Honor, given the new circumstances regarding child welfare, we request an immediate temporary custody hearing. Mrs. Morrison, are you prepared to respond to these allegations? Jake stood slowly. Your Honor, we request time to review these new filings and prepare an adequate response. You have 48 hours. We'll reconvene Thursday morning at 9 a.m. Until then, current custody arrangements remain in place. As the gavel fell, Sarah realized she had just bought herself 2 days to save her children and her future. She had no idea how she was going to do it, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The journalist in her wasn't dead yet. That evening, Sarah sat in her modest suburban kitchen, surrounded by legal documents and memories. The house felt enormous and empty, with Emma and Ryan at David's estate for their scheduled overnight visit. She had exactly 47 hours before the custody hearing that could determine whether she would ever have a real home with her children again. Jake had dropped off 3 boxes of discovery materials, but most of it was David's financial records proving his wealth and stability, character references from business associates, philanthropic board members, and family friends. A perfect portrait of an upstanding citizen and devoted father. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Meet me at Riverside Diner tomorrow at 10 a.m. I have information about David you need to hear. Come alone. E.V. She stared at the message, her journalist instincts immediately suspicious. Random tips usually led nowhere, but sometimes they cracked cases wide open. With 46 hours left, she couldn't afford to ignore any possibility. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Riverside Diner 15 minutes early. The old-fashioned restaurant was nearly empty, just a few truckers and late-shift workers grabbing breakfast. She chose a corner booth with clear sight lines to all entrances and exits. At exactly 10 a.m., a petite Latina woman in her mid-30s approached the table. She had dark circles under intelligent brown eyes and kept glancing nervously toward the windows. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Elena Vasquez. I used to work for your husband. Sarah gestured for her to sit. What kind of work? Executive assistant. I manage his calendar, travel, correspondence, all the personal stuff his corporate assistants didn't handle. Elena slid into the booth across from Sarah. I know about the women. What women? Elena opened her purse and pulled out a small flash drive. David has a pattern. Successful women who threaten his ego or have something he wants, he systematically destroys them. I need specifics. Dr. Maria Santos, brilliant programmer who developed the core algorithm for Sterling Solutions. David convinced her to sign an intellectual property agreement during their brief relationship. When she tried to get credit for her work, he had her visa status investigated. She's been deported. Sarah felt a chill. When was this? 3 years ago. But there are others. Rachel Kim, a cybersecurity expert who consulted for Sterling Solutions. She discovered vulnerabilities in David's system and recommended fixes. Instead of crediting her work, he fired her and used her security protocols without compensation. When she sued, he buried her in legal fees until she went bankrupt. How do you know all this? Elena looked around the diner again. I handled the NDAs. I scheduled the legal meetings. I watched him plan these women's destruction like they were business strategies. She pushed the flash drive across the table. It's all on here. Financial records, email chains, legal documents. David keeps everything because he's obsessed with control. Sarah picked up the drive, her heart racing. Why are you helping me? Because I have a daughter. She's 6 years old, and I see how David talks about women when he thinks no one important is listening. I can't let him destroy another family. This could be exactly what I need to prove the prenup was signed under fraudulent circumstances. There's more, Elena said quietly. The algorithm that made Sterling Solutions valuable. It wasn't David's invention. He stole it from a collaboration with MIT researchers, including a female professor who died in a car accident before she could establish ownership. Sarah's journalistic instincts were screaming. This was the story of a lifetime, but something felt wrong. Elena, how did you get my number? How did you know about the custody hearing? David isn't the only one with sources. That's not an answer. Elena stood up abruptly. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm taking a huge risk being here. That flash drive contains enough evidence to prove David has been committing fraud for years. Use it wisely. She walked quickly toward the exit, leaving Sarah alone with the flash drive and a dozen new questions. The smart move was to take the information straight to Jake and let him verify its authenticity. But Sarah had been out of investigative work for too long. She needed to understand what she was dealing with before sharing it with anyone else. Back home, Sarah plugged the drive into her laptop. The files were meticulously organized financial spreadsheets, email correspondence, legal documents, even audio recordings. It was a treasure trove of potential evidence, almost too perfect. She started with the financial records, cross-referencing them with public filings from Sterling Solutions. The numbers matched perfectly. Email chains between David and various lawyers showed a clear pattern of targeting successful women, offering them partnerships or consulting deals, then systematically undermining their contributions. But as Sarah dug deeper, something nagged at her. The organization was too clean, the evidence too comprehensive. In her experience, with smoking guns rarely came gift-wrapped. Her phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen. Sarah, where are you? We need to prep for tomorrow's hearing. I'm at home, Jake. I may have found something important. What kind of something? Sarah hesitated. Evidence that David has a pattern of defrauding women business partners. It could prove he married me under false pretenses to steal my professional credibility for his IPO. Sarah, please tell me you didn't do anything reckless. Define reckless? Meeting with mysterious sources, following internet conspiracies. Anything that could make you look unstable in front of a judge. Sarah stared at the flash drive. Jake, what if I told you I have documented proof that David's company was built on stolen intellectual property? I'd tell you to bring it to my office immediately so we can verify its authenticity before anyone else sees it. I'll be there in an hour. As Sarah gathered the files, her laptop chimed with a new email. The sender was Elena Vasquez, but the message made her blood run cold. Mrs. Mitchell, I apologize for the deception. Mr. Sterling made me an offer I couldn't refuse. The flash drive contains fabricated evidence designed to make you appear desperate and delusional. I'm sorry. I hope you understand I had no choice. Sarah stared at the screen, her mind racing. She had been set up. David had anticipated her desperation and provided exactly the kind of evidence she would want to find. If she had taken this to Jake, or worse, presented it in court, she would have destroyed her own credibility completely. With 36 hours until the custody hearing, Sarah realized she wasn't just fighting for her children and her future. She was fighting for her sanity in a game where David controlled all the rules. But he had made one critical mistake. He had reminded her that she was still an investigative journalist, and journalists never stop digging for the truth. Sarah spent the rest of the day in her home office, surrounded by old journalism textbooks and case files from her reporting days. If David was going to play psychological warfare, she needed to remember how to fight back with facts instead of emotion. She started with what she knew for certain. David Sterling had built a technology empire, married her at the height of her journalism career, and was now systematically destroying her credibility. The question was why the elaborate scheme was necessary. Her first call was to Tom Bradley, her former editor at the Washington Herald. Sarah Mitchell. I was wondering when you'd call. Tom's gravelly voice carried decades of newsroom wisdom. Heard about your divorce troubles through the media grapevine. Tom, I need a favor. Can you pull my old files from the tech startup fraud investigation? The one from 12 years ago. The series that won you the Pulitzer, sure. But why? I'm starting to think that investigation and my marriage to David Sterling are more connected than I realized. Interesting theory. I'll have someone dig up the files. Anything specific you're looking for? Any mention of Sterling Solutions or companies that became Sterling Solutions? Names of investors? Shell corporations? Anything that might connect to David's business? Give me 24 hours. Sarah's next call was to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, her former therapist from the postpartum depression period. if David's legal team was using her mental health history as ammunition. She needed professional documentation of her recovery. Sarah, I'm so glad you called, Dr. Walsh said warmly. I've been following the news coverage. How are you holding up? Not great. David's lawyers are claiming I'm mentally unstable and unfit for custody. They're using my postpartum depression from 11 years ago. That's medically and legally inappropriate. Postpartum depression is a common, treatable condition that has no bearing on long-term parenting ability. I can provide documentation of your treatment and recovery. Would you be willing to testify on my behalf? Absolutely, and Sarah, your recovery was complete and permanent. You were an exemplary patient who followed treatment protocols and made full progress. Any suggestion that decade-old postpartum depression affects your current mental state is simply false. By evening, Sarah had made 15 calls to former colleagues, sources, and professional contacts. The picture emerging wasn't pretty for David, but it wasn't the smoking gun she needed either. Jake arrived at 8 p.m. with Chinese takeout and a grim expression. I've reviewed the custody filing in detail, he said, spreading documents across her kitchen table. They're not just claiming you're mentally unstable, they're saying you've been neglecting the children's basic needs. That's insane. Emma and Ryan are my priority. They have statements from the housekeeper saying you've been distracted and distant. The nanny reports that you've missed school events and failed to help with homework. Sarah felt her temper flare. The housekeeper works for David, and the nanny was hired by David's family. Of course they're going to support his story. There's more. They claim Emma has been acting out at school, getting into fights, declining grades. They're saying it's because of instability at home. Emma has been struggling because her father is trying to destroy her mother. Any child would act out under these circumstances. Jake pulled out another file. They have a psychological evaluation from Dr. Harrison Pierce, a child psychologist who examined both kids last week. What? When I never consented to any psychological evaluation? David has legal authority to make medical decisions during his custody time. The evaluation concludes that both children show signs of anxiety and stress consistent with an unstable home environment. Sarah grabbed the report and read quickly. Dr. Pierce's assessment painted her as an emotionally volatile mother who was projecting her own instability onto her children. According to the report, both Emma and Ryan had expressed concerns about their mother's erratic behavior and increasing anger. This is character assassination, Sarah said. They've coached my own children to testify against me. Sarah, even if that's true, we need to prove it, and we have less than 18 hours. Then we better get to work. Sarah showed Jake her contact list and the preliminary research she had compiled. Together, they developed a strategy proved that David had a pattern of manipulating people around him, demonstrate Sarah's continued competence as a mother, and expose the bias in his supporting witnesses. At midnight, Tom Bradley called back. Sarah, you need to see these files immediately. I'm scanning and emailing them now. What did you find? Sterling Solutions wasn't David's startup. According to your original investigation notes, it was founded by 3 MIT researchers, David Sterling, Maria Santos, and Professor Elizabeth Chen. Sarah's pulse quickened. Professor Chen, what happened to her? Died in a car accident 2 months before Sterling Solutions went public. Maria Santos was forced out of the company 6 months later. David Sterling became the sole owner through what your notes call questionable legal maneuvering. Tom, I think I stumbled onto a crime and then married the criminal. It gets worse. The core technology that made Sterling Solutions valuable was based on Professor Chen's research. After her death, David claimed ownership of all intellectual property through a partnership agreement that Maria Santos disputes was forged. Sarah stared at her laptop screen as the files downloaded. Her own investigative notes from 12 years ago were revealing a story she had never been able to prove. But now, with inside access to David's world, she might finally be able to expose the truth. Jake, we're not just fighting a custody battle. We're uncovering corporate fraud on a massive scale. Sarah, focus. We need to save your kids first. Exposing corporate fraud can come later. But Sarah's journalistic instincts were fully awakened now. David hadn't just stolen her future through a fraudulent prenup. He had stolen his entire fortune through a pattern of fraud that began long before their marriage. The question was, could she prove it in 17 hours at 3 a.m.? Sarah sat surrounded by printouts, laptop screens, and legal documents. Jake had fallen asleep on her couch, exhausted from 16 hours of preparation, but Sarah couldn't sleep. The pieces of a massive puzzle were finally starting to connect. Her original investigation into tech startup fraud had focused on venture capital manipulation and investor deception. She had documented suspicious patterns in early-stage funding, questionable intellectual property transfers, and the mysterious disappearances of female entrepreneurs from the tech scene. But she had never proven direct criminal activity. The investigation stalled when key witnesses refused to cooperate, and legal threats forced her to abandon certain lines of inquiry. 6 months later, she met David Sterling at a tech conference and fell in love with a charming billionaire who seemed nothing like the corrupt executives she had been investigating. Now, reading her own notes with fresh eyes, Sarah realized she had been investigating David all along without knowing it. Her phone buzzed at 4 a.m., unknown number again. But this time the caller ID showed a familiar area code, Boston, Massachusetts. Mrs. Mitchell, this is Dr. Maria Santos. I believe Elena Vasquez mentioned my name. Sarah's heart raced. Dr. Santos, I thought you had been deported. I was, but I've been fighting the deportation ruling for 3 years. Elena told me about your situation before David got to her. Are you safe to talk? I'm calling from my lawyer's office in Boston. Mrs. Mitchell, everything Elena told you about David stealing my algorithm was true, but the evidence she gave you was fabricated. I figured that out. Can you provide real evidence? I can do better than that. I can give you the original algorithm source code, timestamped development logs, and email correspondence proving David stole my work and forged intellectual property agreements. Sarah grabbed a pen. What do you need from me? Legal protection. If I testify against David, he'll try to have me deported again. But if your divorce case exposes his fraud, it might give my immigration lawyer enough ammunition to prove I was targeted for retaliation. Dr. Santos, I have a custody hearing in 5 hours. Can you get to Connecticut by 8 a.m.? I'm already driving. I'll be there by 7. Sarah shook Jake awake. We have a real witness, a Dr. Maria Santos, the programmer whose algorithm David stole. She's coming to testify. Jake rubbed his eyes. Sarah, introducing new witnesses at the last minute is risky. If her testimony isn't directly relevant to custody, the judge might exclude it. But if her testimony proves David built his fortune on fraud, it could invalidate the prenup entirely. Everything changes if we can prove David married me under false pretenses. That's a huge if. And even if you're right, custody and financial settlement are separate issues. Sarah pulled up her laptop and showed Jake the email chains from her original investigation. Look at the timeline. David's company went public 6 months after our wedding. The IPO prospectus listed my journalistic credentials and reputation as part of the company's credibility profile. Jake read over her shoulder. They used your Pulitzer Prize as a selling point to investors. My reputation gave Sterling Solutions legitimacy in the marketplace. David didn't just marry me for love, he married me for my professional credibility, which helped his stolen technology sell for billions. If you can prove that, the prenup becomes void due to fraudulent inducement. David gets nothing, and I get everything. At 7 a.m. sharp, Dr. Maria Santos knocked on Sarah's front door. She was a small woman with prematurely gray hair and tired eyes, but her voice carried the confidence of someone who had spent years fighting for justice. Mrs. Mitchell, I brought everything I could carry, Maria said, hefting a messenger bag full of files. Original source code, development logs, email correspondence, and legal documents proving David forged intellectual property agreements? Sarah and Jake spread the materials across the kitchen table. The evidence was overwhelming. Timestamped code showing Maria had developed the encryption algorithm 2 years before David claimed to have invented it. Email chains documenting their collaboration at MIT, and legal documents with forged signatures transferring intellectual property rights to David. This proves David built his entire fortune on stolen technology, Sarah said. But how does this help with custody? Jake asked. Maria pulled out one final document. Because David threatened my daughter to keep me quiet. When I tried to expose the theft 3 years ago, he had Child Protective Services investigate my parenting based on anonymous reports. It took 6 months to clear my name. during which my daughter lived with my sister. Sarah stared at the CPS documents. He threatened your child to silence you. Just like he's threatening yours now. David Sterling doesn't just steal technology. He weaponizes the legal system against anyone who challenges him. Jake looked at his watch. We have 90 minutes to get to court and present this evidence. Sarah, this changes everything. Can we get Dr. Santos qualified as an expert witness? On technology theft? Yes. On David's pattern of using child custody as intimidation? Maybe. As they gathered their materials, Sarah felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. For the first time in 12 years, she was working a real story with real evidence and real stakes. But this time, instead of exposing corruption for a newspaper audience, she was fighting for her children's future. The investigation had become personal, and Sarah Mitchell was about to remind David Sterling exactly what kind of journalist he had tried to destroy. Judge Hawkins called the custody hearing to order at 9 a.m. sharp. David's legal team had expanded overnight, with Marcus Chen supported by 3 additional attorneys and 2 paralegals carrying boxes of supplementary files. The show of force was clearly intended to intimidate. Sarah sat beside Jake at the plaintiff's table, with Dr. Maria Santos in the gallery behind them. They had decided to keep Maria's presence quiet until the right moment. Mr. Chen, you may present your case, Judge Hawkins said. Marcus Chen stood with theatrical confidence. Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Mrs. Mitchell poses a clear and present danger to the psychological well-being of her children. Through expert testimony and documented evidence, we will show that her deteriorating mental state makes her unfit for custody. The first witness was Dr. Harrison Pierce, the child psychologist who had evaluated Emma and Ryan. His testimony painted Sarah as an unstable mother whose own emotional problems were traumatizing her children. Dr. Pierce, Marcus Chen asked, in your professional opinion, what would be the psychological impact on these children if they remained in an unstable home environment? Continued exposure to parental conflict and emotional volatility could result in long-term anxiety disorders, behavioral problems, and attachment issues. Dr. Pierce replied smoothly. Jake stood for cross-examination. Dr. Pierce, did you interview Mrs. Mitchell during your evaluation? That wasn't necessary for my assessment. Not so you diagnosed a mother's mental fitness without speaking to her. I evaluated the children's psychological state and identified the source of their distress. Did you consider that children might be distressed by a contentious divorce rather than by their mother's parenting? Marcus Chen objected. Speculation. Sustained, Judge Hawkins ruled. Jake continued. Dr. Pierce, who requested and paid for your evaluation? Mr. Sterling's legal team. And how much were you paid for this assessment? $50,000. Jake let that number hang in the air. No further questions. The next witness was Victoria Sterling, David's sister and family lawyer. Victoria was a formidable woman in her mid-40s, with platinum blonde hair and the cold confidence of old money. Ms. Sterling, Marcus Chen asked, have you observed Mrs. Mitchell's behavior during family gatherings over the past year? Yes, Sarah has become increasingly erratic and hostile. She makes inappropriate comments, argues with David in front of the children, and appears to be drinking heavily. Can you provide specific examples? At last Christmas dinner, Sarah accused David of hiding money and threatened to expose what she called his real business practices. She was clearly intoxicated and became verbally abusive when David tried to calm her down. Sarah scribbled furiously on a legal pad and handed Jake a note. Victoria is lying. I don't drink, and I was never inappropriate at Christmas. Jake stood for cross-examination. Ms. Sterling, you're both David's sister and his attorney. Correct. I serve as family counsel. Yes. So you have a financial interest in the outcome of this custody case. I have an interest in protecting my nephew and niece. Miss Sterling, you mentioned Mrs. Mitchell threatened to expose David's business practices. What did you understand that to mean? Victoria hesitated for the first time. She was making baseless accusations about David's company. What kind of accusations? Marcus Chen objected. Relevance. Your Honor, Jake replied. If Mrs. Mitchell was making legitimate concerns about illegal business practices, Her behavior might appear quite different than if she was making delusional accusations. I'll allow limited questioning, Judge Hawkins ruled. Ms. Sterling, did Sarah accuse David of specific crimes? She claimed he had stolen technology and defrauded investors. Did you investigate these claims? They were obviously false. How do you know they were false? Victoria's composure cracked slightly. Because David is an honest businessman. Ms. Sterling, are you aware that Sterling Solutions was originally co-founded by David, Dr. Maria Santos, and the late Professor Elizabeth Chen? Marcus Chen shot to his feet. Objection. This line of questioning is completely irrelevant to child custody. Jake turned to Judge Hawkins. Your Honor, we believe Mrs. Mitchell's concerns about her husband's business practices are directly relevant to understanding her behavior and state of mind. Where is this going? Mr. Morrison. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Sterling built his fortune through systematic fraud and theft of intellectual property. If Mrs. Mitchell discovered this fraud, her emotional distress would be entirely reasonable rather than evidence of mental instability. Judge Hawkins looked intrigued despite herself. You may continue, but keep it focused. Jake turned back to Victoria. Ms. Sterling, what happened to Dr. Maria Santos's ownership stake in Sterling Solutions? I don't know the details of early business partnerships. Are you aware that Dr. Santos developed the core encryption algorithm that made Sterling Solutions valuable? I don't have technical knowledge about the company's products. Ms. Sterling, are you aware that Dr. Santos is sitting in this courtroom today? Victoria's eyes darted to the gallery, where Maria Santos stood up slowly. Marcus Chen was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is ambush testimony. We haven't had opportunity to review any evidence or prepare cross-examination. Judge Hawkins looked at Jake sternly. Mr. Morrison, do you have documentation to support these allegations? Yes, Your Honor, Dr. Santos has original source code, development logs, and email correspondence proving that David Sterling stole the technology that made him a billionaire. The courtroom erupted. David's legal team huddled frantically, while Victoria Sterling stared at Maria Santos with obvious recognition and fear. Judge Hawkins banged her gavel. Order, Mr. Morrison. This is highly irregular. Your Honor, we discovered this evidence less than 12 hours ago, but it directly relates to Mrs. Mitchell's fitness as a mother. If she was trying to expose legitimate criminal activity rather than making delusional accusations, her emotional state becomes entirely understandable. Marcus Chen stood up desperately. Your Honor, even if these allegations were true, which we vehemently deny, they have no bearing on child custody. This is a transparent attempt to distract from Mrs. Mitchell's documented mental health issues. Sarah stood up suddenly. Your Honor, may I address the court? Mrs. Mitchell, you're represented by counsel? Your Honor, I'm also an investigative journalist. For 12 years, I've been living with a man who systematically stole intellectual property, defrauded investors, and threatened anyone who tried to expose him. When I finally realized what he was doing, he used the legal system to destroy my credibility and threaten my children. Judge Hawkins looked fascinated despite the chaos. Mrs. Mitchell, these are serious allegations. Dr. Santos can prove everything I've said. David Sterling isn't just an unfaithful husband. He's a criminal who has been using our marriage and my professional reputation to legitimize his stolen empire. Marcus Chen's voice rose to near shouting. Your Honor, this is exactly the kind of delusional thinking that proves Mrs. Mitchell is unfit for custody. But Judge Hawkins was studying Sarah with new interest. Mr. Morrison, call your witness. Dr. Maria Santos walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity. After being sworn in, she looked directly at David for the first time in 3 years. His face had gone pale, and his confident demeanor had evaporated completely. Dr. Santos, Jake began, please tell the court about your relationship with David Sterling. We were graduate students together at MIT, working under Professor Elizabeth Chen on advanced encryption algorithms. David and I collaborated closely and eventually became romantically involved. What was the nature of your collaboration? Maria pulled out a thick folder. We were developing quantum-resistant encryption protocols for Professor Chen's research project. I was the lead programmer. David handled business development, and Professor Chen provided theoretical oversight. Who developed the core algorithm that became the foundation of Sterling Solutions? I did. The source code is time-stamped and documented in these development logs. Maria held up printouts. I can prove that every major breakthrough in our encryption technology originated from my programming work. Jake entered the documents into evidence. Dr. Santos, what happened to this partnership? Professor Chen died in a car accident in November 2012. 2 months later, David claimed that he had developed the algorithm independently and owned all intellectual property rights through a partnership agreement. Did you sign such an agreement? No. David forged my signature on documents transferring my intellectual property rights to him. I have the original copies showing the forgeries. Marcus Chen objected loudly. Your Honor, these are criminal allegations that have never been proven in court. Mr. Chen, Judge Hawkins replied, your client put Mrs. Mitchell's mental state at issue. If her concerns about her husband's business practices are legitimate rather than delusional, that's directly relevant to custody, Jake continued. Dr. Santos, what happened when you tried to challenge David's claims? He threatened me, first with lawsuits I couldn't afford, then with immigration investigations. When I persisted, he had Child Protective Services investigate my parenting based on anonymous reports. Sarah felt her heart stop. Your daughter, David Sterling, used the exact same tactics against me that he's using against you now. When I threatened his stolen empire, he threatened my child. Marcus Chen was frantically conferring with David, but Jake pressed on. Dr. Santos, do you have documentation of these threats, email chains, text messages, and legal documents? David Sterling has a pattern of using child custody as a weapon against women who challenge him. Jake turned to the judge. Your Honor, we request permission to enter Dr. Santos's correspondence with Mr. Sterling into evidence. Objection, Marcus Chen shouted. This is a fishing expedition designed to prejudice the court against my client. Judge Hawkins examined the documents Jake handed her. As she read, her expression grew increasingly serious. Mr. Chen, I'm going to allow this evidence. These communications appear directly relevant to the custody question. Jake handed copies to the court reporter. Dr. Santos, please read the text message from David Sterling, dated March 15, 2022. Maria read clearly, if you continue making false accusations about Sterling Solutions, I will ensure that your immigration status and custody of your daughter receive appropriate scrutiny. Some battles aren't worth fighting. The courtroom was completely silent. Even David's legal team had stopped shuffling papers. Dr. Santos, did you interpret this as a threat? Absolutely. Within a week, Immigration Services reopened my deportation case, and Child Protective Services received an anonymous report claiming I was an unfit mother. Sarah stood up again. Your Honor, this is exactly what David is doing to me. He's using the courts and government agencies to terrorize any woman who threatens his power. Judge Hawkins looked directly at David for the first time. Mr. Sterling, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you wish to respond? David whispered urgently with Marcus Chen, who stood reluctantly. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence of any wrongdoing. Dr. Santos is a disgruntled former partner with obvious motives to fabricate evidence. Mr. Chen, how do you explain the forged signatures on the intellectual property agreements? We dispute that any signatures were forged. Jake pulled out another document. Your Honor, we have a handwriting analysis from a certified forensic examiner comparing Dr. Santos's authentic signature with the signature on the partnership agreement. The analysis conclusively proves forgery. Marcus Chen looked like he wanted to object, but he had no grounds. The evidence was overwhelming. Judge Hawkins studied the handwriting analysis carefully. Mr. Morrison, you mentioned that Mrs. Mitchell was investigating tech startup fraud when she met Mr. Sterling. Was Sterling Solutions part of that investigation? Sarah answered before Jake could respond. Your Honor, I spent 6 months investigating suspicious patterns in early-stage tech funding and intellectual property theft. I documented everything but could never prove criminal activity because key witnesses were intimidated into silence. By whom? I didn't know at the time, but reading my own investigation notes now, Every suspicious pattern I identified points directly to David Sterling and his business partners. Jake handed the judge a thick folder. Your Honor, these are Mrs. Mitchell's original investigation files from 12 years ago. They document systematic fraud in the tech startup community, including suspicious intellectual property transfers and the mysterious disappearances of female entrepreneurs from the industry. Judge Hawkins flipped through Sarah's original reporting notes. Mrs. Mitchell, are you saying you unknowingly investigated your future husband? Yes, Your Honor. And I believe David pursued me romantically to monitor my investigation and neutralize the threat I posed to his stolen empire. Marcus Chen stood desperately. Your Honor, even if these conspiracy theories were true, they don't change the fact that Mrs. Mitchell has demonstrated mental instability and poses a risk to her children. But Judge Hawkins was no longer listening to David's legal team. She was studying Sarah with the intense focus of someone reassessing everything she thought she knew about the case. Mrs. Mitchell, if what you're alleging is true, then your emotional distress and concerns about your husband's activities would be entirely reasonable responses to discovering massive fraud and corruption. Yes, Your Honor. I'm not having a mental breakdown. I'm having a rational response to learning that my entire marriage was built on lies and crimes. Judge Hawkins looked at Maria Santos. Dr. Santos, in your opinion, is Mrs. Mitchell's description of David Sterling's behavior consistent with your own experiences? Absolutely. David Sterling is a master manipulator who uses the legal system as a weapon against anyone who threatens him. Mrs. Mitchell isn't crazy. She's a victim of systematic psychological abuse by a dangerous criminal. The courtroom erupted again, but this time Judge Hawkins let the chaos continue for several moments before calling for order. When the room finally quieted, she delivered her ruling. Based on the evidence presented today, Judge Hawkins began, this court finds that the allegations against Mrs. Mitchell's mental fitness appear to be part of a broader pattern of intimidation and manipulation. Marcus Chen jumped to his feet. Your Honor, we request an immediate recess to review these new allegations and prepare a response. Mr. Chen, you've had 6 months to build your case against Mrs. Mitchell. You chose to base it on claims of mental instability without investigating whether her concerns about her husband's business practices might be legitimate. Judge Hawkins turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm troubled by the evidence suggesting your husband may have pursued marriage with you specifically to neutralize your investigation into his business activities. Your Honor, Sarah replied, I believe David saw my Pulitzer Prize and journalistic reputation as valuable assets for legitimizing his stolen technology company. Our marriage wasn't just personal, it was a business strategy. Jake stood up. Your Honor, if Mr. Sterling married Mrs. Mitchell under false pretenses to gain access to her professional credibility, the prenuptial agreement could be void due to fraudulent inducement. Marcus Chen looked panicked. Your Honor, we object to any expansion of this hearing beyond custody issues. Financial settlements should be addressed separately. Mr. Chen, your client made Mrs. Mitchell's character and mental state the central issue in this case. You can't now argue that evidence proving her character is sound is irrelevant. Judge Hawkins consulted her notes. Dr. Santos, you mentioned email correspondence between yourself and Mr. Sterling. Do any of those communications reference Mrs. Mitchell specifically? Maria Santos pulled out her phone. Yes, Your Honor. In March 2023, David Sterling sent me a text message that said, Sarah is asking too many questions about the early days of the company. If she becomes a problem like you did, I'll handle her the same way. The courtroom fell silent. Even David's legal team looked stunned. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. He was already planning to destroy me a year ago. Judge Hawkins looked directly at David. Mr. Sterling, I'm going to ask you directly, did you marry Mrs. Mitchell at least in part to gain access to her professional reputation and neutralize her investigation into your business activities? David whispered urgently with Marcus Chen, who stood reluctantly. Your Honor, my client invokes his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Regarding marriage fraud, regarding all questions about his business activities, Judge Hawkins made a note. Mr. Sterling, your Fifth Amendment right protects you from criminal prosecution, but it doesn't protect you from adverse inferences in civil proceedings. She turned back to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, Do you have any direct evidence that your husband used your professional reputation to benefit his company? Jake opened his briefcase and pulled out a document. Your Honor, this is the IPO prospectus for Sterling Solutions from January 2013, 6 months after David and Sarah's wedding. Page 12 specifically lists Sarah's Pulitzer Prize and investigative journalism credentials as part of the company's credibility profile for potential investors. Judge Hawkins read the prospectus carefully. This document explicitly markets Mrs. Mitchell's professional achievements as selling points for investing in Sterling Solutions. Your Honor, Jake continued, if David Sterling married Sarah specifically to gain access to her reputation for his fraudulent company, then their entire marriage was based on criminal deception. The prenuptial agreement should be void. Marcus Chen was frantically shuffling through papers. Your Honor, we request time to examine this evidence and prepare a response. Mr. Chen, you've had 6 months to investigate your own client's background. The evidence suggests you may have been representing a criminal enterprise without proper due diligence. Sarah stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to present one final piece of evidence. She pulled out the manila envelope she had been carrying since the proceedings began. These are photographs from our wedding day and early marriage. I want the court to see something. Sarah handed the photos to Judge Hawkins. Your Honor, in every single photo from our engagement period and early marriage, David is wearing a watch that belonged to Professor Elizabeth Chen. She gave it to him as a graduation gift, according to these photos from MIT. Judge Hawkins examined the photos closely. How do you know it belonged to Professor Chen? Maria Santos spoke up. Professor Chen showed me that watch many times. It was a limited edition Omega with a custom engraving. She was very proud of it. Dr. Santos, what happened to Professor Chen's personal effects after her death? Her family said many items went missing from her office before they could collect them, including that watch, Sarah continued. Your Honor, David has been wearing his murder victim's watch as a trophy for over a decade. He's a psychopath who not only stole Professor Chen's intellectual property, but also her personal belongings. Marcus Chen stood up desperately. Your Honor, this is pure speculation and character assassination. But Judge Hawkins was studying the photographs with intense focus. Mrs. Mitchell, these photos appear to show the watch clearly. Dr. Santos, are you certain this is the same watch that belonged to Professor Chen? Absolutely certain. The custom engraving is visible in these photos. Judge Hawkins set down the photos and looked at David Sterling with obvious disgust. Mr. Sterling, I find the totality of evidence presented today to be extremely disturbing. You appear to have built your fortune on stolen intellectual property, threatened women and children to maintain your criminal enterprise, and manipulated the legal system to silence your victims. She turned to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, far from being mentally unstable, you appear to be an investigative journalist who discovered a massive fraud and has been systematically terrorized for trying to expose it. Marcus Chen made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, none of these allegations have been proven in a criminal court. They're based on speculation and circumstantial evidence. Mr. Chen, this is a family court proceeding to determine child custody. The standard of evidence is preponderance of proof, not beyond reasonable doubt. And the preponderance of evidence clearly shows that your client is a dangerous criminal who poses a threat to Mrs. Mitchell and her children. Judge Hawkins picked up her gavel. I'm prepared to rule on custody and the validity of the prenuptial agreement. Sarah held her breath, realizing that the next few words would determine not just her future, but the futures of Emma and Ryan, and possibly the fate of David Sterling's criminal empire. Judge Hawkins arranged her papers deliberately, letting the tension build in the courtroom. David Sterling sat motionless, his confident facade completely shattered. For the first time in 12 years, he looked like what he truly was, a cornered criminal facing exposure. In the matter of custody, Judge Hawkins began, this court finds that Mr. Sterling's allegations against Mrs. Mitchell's mental fitness are not only unfounded, but appear to be part of a systematic campaign of psychological abuse and intimidation. Sarah felt tears of relief starting to form. Jake squeezed her shoulder supportively. The evidence presented today demonstrates that Mrs. Mitchell's concerns about her husband's business activities were not delusional symptoms of mental illness, but rational responses to discovering evidence of massive fraud and criminal activity. Marcus Chen stood up. Your Honor, we respectfully request. Mr. Chen, I'm not finished. Judge Hawkins' voice carried the authority of someone who had heard enough lies for one day. The court finds that Mr. Sterling has used threats against children as a weapon to silence women who challenge his criminal enterprise. This pattern of behavior makes him unfit for custody of any child. David Sterling finally showed emotion, his face contorting with rage. He whispered urgently to Marcus Chen, who shook his head reluctantly. Furthermore, Judge Hawkins continued, the evidence strongly suggests that Mr. Sterling pursued marriage with Mrs. Mitchell specifically to gain access to her professional reputation and neutralize her investigation into his fraudulent business activities. She held up the IPO prospectus. The Sterling Solutions public offering explicitly marketed Mrs. Mitchell's Pulitzer Prize and journalistic credentials as selling points for investors. This constitutes fraudulent inducement, making the prenuptial agreement void and unenforceable. The courtroom erupted. Marcus Chen was shouting objections, while David Sterling's face turned red with fury. Sarah felt a decade of fear and uncertainty lifting from her shoulders. Order, Judge Hawkins banged her gavel. Mr. Sterling, you will remain seated and silent or be held in contempt. When the room quieted, Judge Hawkins delivered her final ruling. This court awards full physical and legal custody of Emma and Ryan Sterling to their mother, Sarah Mitchell. Mr. Sterling will have supervised visitation only, pending the outcome of criminal investigations into his business activities. Sarah burst into tears of relief. After months of terror about losing her children, she was finally safe. Regarding the prenuptial agreement, this court finds it void due to fraudulent inducement. Mrs. Mitchell is entitled to 50% of all marital assets, including Sterling Solutions and all related intellectual property. Marcus Chen jumped to his feet. Your Honor, we intend to appeal this ruling immediately. Mr. Chen, you certainly have that right. However, I'm also ordering an immediate freeze on all Sterling Solutions assets, pending investigation into the allegations of intellectual property theft and fraud. Judge Hawkins turned to Maria Santos. Dr. Santos, I'm recommending that the District Attorney's Office investigate the evidence you've presented regarding forged documents and stolen intellectual property. You may also wish to consult with immigration attorneys about reopening your deportation case. Finally, Judge Hawkins addressed Sarah directly. Mrs. Mitchell, you've endured systematic abuse and intimidation that would have broken most people. Your strength in fighting for your children and exposing this criminal enterprise is commendable. As the gavel fell, Sarah realized she had done more than win a custody battle. She had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had destroyed multiple lives and built a billion-dollar empire on stolen dreams. David Sterling was finally going to face justice. But the courtroom victory was only the beginning. 6 months later, Sarah sat in her home office. No longer the modest suburban kitchen where she had fought for her future, but a spacious room in the Manhattan penthouse that was now legally hers. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was writing the exposé of David Sterling from his own stolen fortress. The criminal investigation had moved swiftly once Judge Hawkins' ruling opened the floodgates. Federal prosecutors found a pattern of intellectual property theft, investor fraud, and witness intimidation spanning over a decade. David Sterling wasn't just a fraudulent businessman. He was the center of a criminal enterprise that had systematically destroyed female entrepreneurs and stolen their innovations. Emma and Ryan were adapting well to their new life. The supervised visits with David had stopped entirely when he was arrested on federal fraud charges. The children were receiving counseling to help them understand how their father had manipulated everyone around him, including them. Mom, are you famous now? Emma asked, walking into Sarah's office with a cup of tea. Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she was reviewing the final draft of her investigative series for the Washington Herald. Tom Bradley had welcomed her back with enthusiasm, and the Sterling Solutions exposé was set to run as a 5-part series starting Monday. I think I'm more like infamous, Sarah replied. People are calling me the journalist who brought down a tech billionaire. Dr. Santos called, Emma said. She wanted to thank you again for helping her get her citizenship approved. Sarah smiled. Maria Santos had not only avoided deportation, but had received a special visa for victims of criminal activity. She was now working for a legitimate tech company and developing the next generation of encryption technology under her own name. And Jake called too. He said the documentary crew wants to interview you tomorrow about the other cases. Sarah's investigation had uncovered dozens of women who had been victimized by David's network: tech entrepreneurs, researchers, journalists, and business consultants who had all been systematically destroyed when they threatened the empire built on stolen intellectual property. The documentary, titled The Predator's Playbook, would air on Netflix in 3 months and was already generating Oscar buzz. But more importantly, it was inspiring other victims to come forward and seek justice. Ryan appeared in the doorway. "Mom, are you going to keep being a journalist forever?" "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because I think you're really good at catching bad guys." Sarah laughed. "I think I'll keep catching bad guys for a while longer." Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar: Boston, Massachusetts. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the FBI. We've been following your investigation into Sterling Solutions, and we'd like to discuss expanding our criminal probe." "What kind of expansion?" "We've identified a network of technology companies that appear to be using similar tactics to steal intellectual property and silence victims. Your investigative methods and sources could be crucial to exposing a much larger conspiracy." Sarah looked at her children, who were listening with interest. Emma and Ryan had learned that their mother wasn't just a suburban housewife, but a real-life superhero who fought corruption and protected innocent people. "Agent Torres, I'd be happy to help. When do we start?" As Sarah scheduled the FBI meeting, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. A year ago, she had been a broken woman facing financial ruin and the loss of her children. Today, she was a millionaire journalist with custody of her kids and a new mission to expose corporate criminals. But the real victory wasn't the money or the recognition. It was the knowledge that David Sterling would spend the next 20 years in federal prison, and his network of enablers was being systematically dismantled. Most importantly, Emma and Ryan would grow up knowing that their mother had fought impossible odds to protect them and expose the truth. They would understand that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite being terrified. Sarah opened her laptop and began typing the final paragraph of her exposé. The Sterling Solutions scandal reveals a disturbing pattern in American business: wealthy men systematically targeting successful women, stealing their work, and using the legal system to silence them. But it also demonstrates that truth has a way of surfacing, especially when brave women refuse to be intimidated into silence. David Sterling built his empire on stolen dreams and destroyed lives. Today, he sits in federal prison while his victims reclaim their innovations and their futures. The predator has become the prey, and justice has finally been served. But the fight isn't over. Across America, there are more David Sterlings, more stolen technologies, and more women waiting for someone to believe their stories and help them seek justice. The investigation continues. Sarah saved the document and closed her laptop. Tomorrow, she would begin working with the FBI to expose the next network of criminals. But tonight, she would have dinner with her children and celebrate the fact that they were finally safe. The prenup twist had become something far bigger than a divorce case. It had become a movement to protect innovation, expose corruption, and ensure that brilliant women could pursue their dreams without fear of being destroyed by predatory men. And Sarah Mitchell, the investigative journalist who had never stopped digging for the truth, was just getting started. Outside her window, the lights of Manhattan twinkled like stars, each one representing a dream, a story, a life worth protecting. Sarah smiled, knowing that she had found her purpose again. The truth was powerful, but a woman fighting for her children was unstoppable.